was born August 9, 1931. I am the offspring, the youngest offspring of Mark and Ethel Wheeler. And mother was a Hayman. I could be the last of the first cousins. And now Aunt Retha may have had Wayne and Dickie. And we've lost touch. I don't know if they are still with us. But when Eric was killed in Vietnam, which was a very sad time, and we went to the funeral in Jacksonville, and this is when I realized where my size shoe came from. Aunt Thelma's bedroom probably had, to me, it was 4 or 5 double beds. And with all the aunts there, I knew if I didn't get to bed early, I would never get to sleep. I didn't quite make it. All the aunts came in, and when they were in bed, and I looked around, they're all in their nightgowns, and I saw their feet. I thought, oh my gosh, the Hayman feet, we are doomed. And I have a very good understanding. I remember the pictures of Grandpa Hayman in overalls and barefoot. And at one time, Leanne, my daughter, and I decided to do some research on the Grandpa Hayman because we knew nothing about his background. And it didn't take us long to realize why, because he was born into a family of Lumbee Indians, in case all of you did not know. And we have the genealogy, his parents, and his goes, I've forgotten how far back we went.
16-somethings.
But Grandpa Hayman was born in Lumberton, South Carolina in 1853.
North Carolina.
Is it North Carolina?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But tell me about that story when he was in the bank.
Well, he was we found out he was the largest landowner in Turner County. He was born, of course, in Lumberton, but at some point they moved, when he was a baby, down around Sumner in Sylvester.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that's where he met Grandma Hayman. But I have a feeling when they moved back there, when he moved over to Turner County, and never in all those years ever heard that he was from the Lumbee Indian. But he had gone into the bank one morning, and there was a bank salesman, had been probably in Florida because he had a bag of oranges. And he saw my grandfather walk in, and the tale goes that the salesman picked up an orange and said, "Hey boy, catch it." And with that, the bank president looked at the salesman and said, quote, "He owns this bank." I loved it. The unions started at Hopewell. But Hopewell has been there as long. Of course, I never met Grandfather Hayman.
Okay.
He died before I can remember him. But I know he had built Hopewell, and then the cemetery down the road. Mother and Dad's oldest son, Carlos, died while they lived in Amboy, and he is buried there at the cemetery.
I remember all the pictures of the sisters out front.
Yeah, and there is a picture of the sisters with grandmother with her shawl on, which you have. First recollection of grandmother, probably 3 years old, on the porch in Amboy. And I loved, when we went there, the aunts were there. And I loved sitting and hearing their stories. But when they really started getting serious, they sent me into grandmother's room. And I remember going to bed with grandmother in her feather bed, and you could sink down until it would almost cover you. And then grandmother would come in, and those are really fond memories. And I know as the first cousins, not many of us were left that could have said they slept with their grandmother. I remember the kitchen and the wood stove, and the well was out in front, and mother would draw the water so it could warm up during the day for me to get the clay off of my feet from walking to Ben Pate's candy store down the road, and that clay was so hot. But we loved his candy store. Uncle Joe and Aunt Clifford, they lived to the right of grandmother Hayman, kind of up on a hill. And I loved to go up and visit. I spent most of my time, though, with Aunt Mary and Uncle Lewis on their farm. And Mark was 5 years older, my brother, and he played with Mary Frances. And we would run across Uncle Lewis's field. And way in the back of the field was a pine woods. And I remembered them taking me back there, and there was a pool of water that had been boarded up, and fresh water was coming in, and that's where the black people baptized. And they had a ladder that would go up into this pool. It was like to me at that age, because I was 5 years old when my grandmother died. But I remember, though, probably about 3 going up and sleeping with grandmother before she died. And when grandmother got sick, mother, of course, was up with the other sisters. And she had taken our car. And when she called Dad and said that grandmother had died, Dad put me on the train in Manatee County, and we took the train to Ashburn. But we had to change trains in Jacksonville. And a friend of Dad's met us, and we must have had a wait, because that was my first ride on an escalator, which was very exciting. But anyway, we got on to Ashburn, and Mother picked us up, and we went to the funeral. But after that, of course, we didn't go back to grandmother's. I think that Uncle Monroe probably lived there with grandmother for a while. And then Uncle Monroe started coming to visit all the sisters and would stay for a month or so. I know that he would come down and work with Dad at the packing house. And we all loved it. Actually, we were at Aunt Thelma's, and her bedroom had, I don't know how many double beds in it. And I knew if I didn't get to bed early, because they all snored, I wouldn't be able to go to sleep. But then they all came in, and they were all in their nightgowns with their feet, and I looked at all the Heyman women feet. I knew then I was doomed. Said that. Even when we went to visit Grandmother Heyman, Mother spent a lot of time with us at Aunt Mary's.
Where did Aunt Mary live? Was she
Down
just
the
out?
road. Well, actually, it's still the Hobby property.
Okay.
That's where Luther.
And Grace and
Yeah.
Yeah.
They still have. And then Luther evidently acquired.
About 1,500 acres, I think.
Yeah. The ones that were a lot older than me, like my sister and Warren, I hardly remember. The ones I remember are Uncle Monroe's, Evelyn and Jane. I know Aunt Susie Sellers. I can't remember all their names. Then Uncle Perry. There was a tale about Uncle Perry, though, and someone else that decided Grandpa Heyman was drying tobacco, and they were going to get in the back of the barn and smoke. Well, they burned down the whole barn. Those are stories you don't forget. And then the time that the older grandchildren were playing in Grandmother's house, hide and seek, and they pushed the china cabinet in front of the dining room door, and the older boys pushed it open, and of course it knocked the china cabinet off and broke all of Grandma's china. And I'm sure back then the only catalog they had was Sears and Roebuck. I imagine most of her things came from Sears.
Yep. I forgot that story.
Yeah. See, they just pop in.
They do.
I have such fond memories looking back, riding on the tractor with Uncle Lewis and playing in his hayloft. And we spent most of our time with Aunt Mary in the summers after that, because Dad ran peach houses in South Carolina and North Georgia. And we would all spend the summer in Amboy. And Aunt Mary had a grape arbor. And I know that Mother, she canned, or they made jellies and grapes. But Aunt Mary and Uncle Lewis's well was actually covered. It was indoor plumbing, and it was on the back porch. And then I remember visiting Aunt Susie. And she started out with the family reunions, I think, up there. Because I remember going to her house, and she had the most delicious fried apple tarts and peach tarts. and then Uncle David and Aunt Gertrude, and Uncle Perry and Aunt Estelle. And then we had Aunt Carrie with the twins Ruth and Ruby. They had one son, Clarence, and a daughter, Eloise. And I have to tell this tale about Aunt Carrie. Mother had always wanted to take a picture of Aunt Carrie and send to Jergens Lotion. She had evidently beautiful skin, and they contributed that to the Jergens Lotion. And then Aunt Thelma had Carolyn and Gloria, which I was always extreme. They lived in Tampa for a while, long while. And then we had Aunt Retha, and they lived in Ruskin. The Heyman boys were farmers.
Mm-hmm. Tell me about Mom Wheeler. She married at 14?
Just 14.
Yeah.
And it was not a happy. And they lived with the Wheelers up the road because they ran off and got married. And probably after 2 weeks, the story goes that Grandpa Heyman drove up in front of their house in a buckboard and said, "Effie, you think it's time you came home?" And she went and packed her little bag and jumped in that buckboard. And when Dad got in from wherever he was working, found out that Mother had gone back home, he went down to the Heyman family. And Grandpa Heyman back then bought acreage for every one of his children. And there was a farm down the road that he bought for Dad. And he planted pecan trees. And it lined the road to Amboy. And that's where they lived when the boll weevil came through.
I didn't know that story. I didn't know about the pecan trees.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that Daddy worked for Grandpa Heyman.
Mm-hmm.
I know they had tobacco and cotton, and they had a lot of pine trees, and they would cut them and drain them and sell the turpentine.
I remember, I didn't do it, but Kurt and I think David Hobby, they used to go out in the fields and find the arrowheads.
Oh yeah, that was a big thing. Thank you, Lord, for the boll weevil that came through. Or I would still be a little girl barefoot in Amboy, maybe.
Probably.
But the boll weevil came through and just wiped our family out. And Dad had an opportunity. And can you imagine moving his family from Amboy down to Orlando? 2 children. And that's where the word got out that Mark Wheeler formed, and Manatee Fruit Company hired Dad probably in 1929 to manage Manatee Fruit Company, which was probably one of the largest fruit growers and shippers.
Well, they had pineapple back then too. There are pictures of them.
Yeah.
And he rode around the fields on a horse.
And Dad grew the first iceberg lettuce. And I remember it was a big thing to ship that to New York. And they had ice, I guess they were called freight cars. And they would stop along the way, and they had ice houses along the railroad, and that they would fill those cars with ice to keep them on ice.
I've seen pictures of Grandpa. He rode around the fields on a horse.
A gentleman. He wore always white dress shirts, lace-up boots, and joffers. And I remember at night him coming in, and he would turn around and put his one foot on my rear end to help me pull his boots off. Mother and Dad's oldest son, Carlos, died while they lived in Amboy, and he is buried there at the cemetery. Lived to be 3, and he died of the flu.
And Mom almost died of the flu.
Mother couldn't even go to the funeral. It was a hard time. And you wonder how in the world did the flu pass to Amboy, Georgia? Going to Amboy was with Mark. See, there was 12 and 16 years difference between Warren and Inez and me.
Mm-hmm.
And Earl, I'm wondering if Mother was pregnant with Earl when they moved to Florida, because she went back to Georgia, and Earl was born in Georgia. But all of us were born in Florida. Well,
you and Inez and Mark.
No. Inez is older than me.
I know. But was she born in Florida?
No.
Okay.
The only ones born in Florida were Mark and me.
Okay.